And sometimes we have to talk about others in a negative way. And yet we don't want to sin as we do so. And so it would be easier if all there was to good communication was not talking. That would be easy. Then you just don't talk and you're fine. But God calls you to something bigger than just not talking. If you don't talk, you're actually not using speech the way God wants you to. You need to talk. Healthy speech requires talking. So we have to talk, and sometimes healthy speech will require speaking negatively about others. So sometimes it's not healthy to not speak negatively. There are times where the right thing is actually to speak negatively. It's not automatically unloving to speak negatively about others. It doesn't mean that you are not loving someone just because you speak negatively about them. It can't mean that, because we find Jesus doing that. We find Paul doing that. We find God doing that. But how do we do that without slipping into the kind of speech that does long-term damage to others? Because it's, of course, easy to justify yourself. And so we want to think about, okay, part of life is actually having to make evaluations. And part of life is sometimes spotting sin and error in others. And part of life sometimes requires talking about that. But how do we do that without becoming the kind of person who's speaking in ways that really don't honor Christ and don't help people? And so that's the question I want us to talk about. And one place that helps us think about that is James chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And so we mentioned this passage last time we were together, but I want us to look at it just a little more carefully. What is the wrong kind of speech we need to avoid? Where does this kind of speech come from? And why is it a problem? And let's just start with the context for these verses, James 4, 11 and 12. Back in James chapter 3, he tells us that he's writing to people who think they're ready to be teachers but can't control their tongue. So these are Christian people that he's writing to, or at least they think they're Christians. And they don't just think that they're Christians, they actually think that they are pretty mature Christians. And yet they don't have control over the way they communicate, and that's a problem for James, and he warns them about it. And then in James chapter 3, verse 13, he makes clear that he's talking to people who think they're wise, but really they're self-centered, and the results are chaos. They have jealousy and selfish ambition in their hearts, and that is creating disorder and every evil, vile practice. Then in James chapter 4, verse 1, he has to address why they're having conflicts with one another. And ultimately, he says what's at the root of your problems with other people is a problem in your relationship with God, and that problem is connected to pride. Now, in James 4, verse 11, he's going to give an illustration of how pride shows up in the way that we communicate. And so he begins with a command. And we're going to talk about two things as we look at this verse. First thing is what we're not supposed to do and why. And this is the command, the beginning of verse 11. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. Family, don't speak evil against one another. Now, what does that mean? Don't speak. So he's identifying this is the wrong kind of speech. But what does that mean? First, we can just give a basic definition. Basically, do not speak evil against one another means do not slander. It's good, I think, to notice that the translation is not simply do not speak against one another. So he doesn't say do not speak against one another. Because sometimes, again, we have to do that. We have to speak against someone. So how do we know that sometimes we do have to speak against others? We're going to look at what this does mean. He says do not speak evil against one another. But before we talk about what that does mean, I just want to pause and make sure we recognize it doesn't mean that we don't ever speak against someone. So how do we know that sometimes we actually have to speak against someone? Any demonstrations you can think of from the scripture? It should be able to think of one or two. Church discipline, people could consider that speaking against someone. The purpose ultimately is to be for them, but it is speaking against them. It's revealing, hey, these guys are in sin, and it's a serious sin, and we can't actually can actually affirm that they're believers. Jesus did. He went over to people's houses for dinner sometimes, actually, and was like, you know what? You invited all the wrong people. And that was socially considered not something nice to say. But he had to say it. And I'm sure the Pharisees were like, who does this guy think he is? Well, Paul, James here technically is kind of speaking against them in this book. He's like, hey guys, not many of you should be teachers. You guys think you're so far advanced, and you're not. You really don't know how to control the way you speak. You're in these conflicts. This is why you're in these conflicts. So this is not a command to not speak against. It's a command not to speak evil against. And so what's he talking about? He's talking about speech whose intentions are hostile. So speech where you're not just speaking against someone for their good, you have a bad purpose in the way that you're speaking against them. If we look at the way James explains what he means in verse 11, I think we can get a better sense of what speaking evil against someone is. He says, because he kind of expands, he says, do not speak evil against one another, brothers. And now he's going to describe it. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother. So that's like a parallel statement. Don't speak evil against your brother. Here's what I mean. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother. They're basically the same thing. And you see this is what's on his heart if you go down to the end of verse 12. He says, but who are you to judge your neighbor? And so this is a concern. Using your words in a hostile way to judge your brother. That's what we have to watch out for. But again, it's not so simple as never judge. He's actually saying never judge in a certain way. So we're looking at James, and James is saying don't judge. But if we looked at other portions of the Bible and we're preaching on those, we might say you need to judge. So there's a certain kind of judging you need to do, and there's a certain kind of judging you must not do. That's why we're having this conversation tonight. Even if we think about the passage we're looking at on Sundays in Colossians chapter 2, if you turn over there, Colossians 2, verse 8, Paul says, see to it that no one takes you captive. And I'm going to preach that sermon on Sunday, but to see to it that no one takes you captive, what do you have to be able to do? You have to be able to evaluate someone, right? And you have to be able to say, no, this person's in error. If that's judging, right? This person, I've evaluated them, I've discerned, they're not the kind of person that I should listen to. And actually, that's a command. Paul says you have to see to it that no one takes you captive. We find Paul, in a sense, judging, if we keep reading, Colossians chapter 2, verse 18. He says, let no one disqualify you. So this one's always, I think, so good. He doesn't say, don't disqualify someone. He says, you have a responsibility not to let them disqualify you. That's different. He doesn't say, you disqualify them. You can't let them disqualify you. And then he talks about them, the way they do that with all this religious talk that's not based on Christ. And at the end, he says, they're puffed up without reason by a sensuous mind. He's talking about the kind of person you got to watch out for. And so he's saying what these guys are doing is wrong, and he's saying what it reveals about them to the Colossians. They are puffed up, and they don't have a reason to be puffed up. So a lot of life requires evaluating. Do not judge your brother cannot mean that you can never evaluate or talk about your evaluations. Sometimes people feel like that. They're like, if you evaluate someone and say something, automatically it means you're not being loving. But it can't mean that. It can't mean that. Because we have to do that. It's not just false teachers. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 says, brothers, if anyone's caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. So he's telling us we need to be able to identify if one of the other persons in church here is caught in sin and to go help them in order to change. And so that obviously means we need to be able to make an evaluation. It can't be judging in the wrong way to say, well, this person's stuck in sin. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to obey Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. So we need to be able to judge the right way. We need to be able to judge the right way. For sure, while not judging the wrong way. And that's where it gets hard. As someone said, judging is necessary but dangerous. Judging is necessary but dangerous. So where do we go wrong with judging? When does it turn into speaking evil against someone? And it does. It does for sure. So first of all, let me just give you some obvious examples of when it goes wrong. First of all, we know it's going wrong when we're speaking our words in a way intended to hurt and not help. So the word that James uses when he says speak evil against, the emphasis is on hostility in the heart of the person speaking it. So when we say things about others just to make someone look badly or to try to take advantage of a particular situation and get what we want, that is obviously speaking evil against somebody. When we're saying that, and we can look at our heart, and our heart is not actually to help, it's to hurt. Obviously, that's the kind of speech we must put off. That's corrupting speech. A second way we can evaluate is whether or not what we're saying is true. So sometimes we can say true things that actually aren't for someone's good. And other times we can just lie. So that's not all there is to slander, lying, but that's something that's true of slander. A lot of times slander is just lies. So we can say things we know are not true about others. That's speaking against them. Sometimes we can say things we don't know are true, and that's slander. So I think I told you the other night about, let's see if I can change this illustration a little bit. Imagine coming into a room. I think I told you this one. Imagine coming into a room and you see someone who looks like they're mad at you, and you've known they've had problems with you in the past. And so you see them, they look mad at you, you go home, and you tell your husband, that person's mad at me. And I went into that room, and they didn't even talk to me. Now, you are slandering because you don't know that they're mad at you. But you're like, but I had 2 weeks before they said something mean to me, so it must be that they're mad at me. No, you don't know that they're mad at you. What if you ask them a question instead of just going away and they say, oh, I just found out that my iPad was stolen. And so the reason they didn't talk to you was because at that moment, their mind is filled with concern about something that just happened to them. But if you don't get that information and you go home and you tell your husband this is what they're doing and this is why they're doing it, then you're slandering. You're saying something that you don't know is true. At the best of the worst, you could say, I wonder, it seems like they might have some concerns with me. And your husband should then say to you, why don't you ask them, or why don't you find out what's happening? If it really is something, or love them. Overlook it. But sometimes we say things about others, we're speaking evil against them, when we say things about others that don't tell the whole story and only emphasize the bad qualities. So that's speaking against someone. It's a kind of lying. I can present a situation to you, and I leave out certain information, or I emphasize certain negative information to give you a picture of a certain situation. That is not the whole picture. And so that's speaking evil against others. Third, when we speak in hypercritical ways. So we shout where the Bible whispers, and we shout with verve about how wrong this person is. But what we're shouting about is not something the Bible shouts about. That's a kind of judging or speaking evil against someone. I heard a story about this man named David Simmons. He was a cornerback for the Dallas Cowboys. And his father was a military man, and he was really demanding. He rarely would say a kind word. He would always push him with harsh criticism to do better. And the father, for some reason, had decided he would never permit his son to feel any satisfaction from his accomplishments, reminding him there were always new goals ahead. So he thought this was the way to get his son to achieve, was by not complimenting or encouraging him, but just kind of telling him, you can do better. So when he was a little boy, his dad gave him a bicycle unassembled with the command that he put it together. And after he struggled to the point of tears with the instructions, his father said, "I knew you couldn't do it." And then he assembled it for him. When he played football in high school, his father was unrelenting in his criticisms. In the backyard of his home, after every game, his dad would go over every play and point out his errors. He said, "Most boys got butterflies in the stomach before the game. I got them afterwards. Facing my father was more stressful than facing any opposing team." By the time he entered college, Dave hated his father and his harsh discipline. He chose to play football at the University of Georgia because its campus was further from home than any school that offered him a scholarship. After college, he became the second-round draft pick of the St. Louis Cardinals professional football club. Joe Namath, who later signed with the Jets, was the club's first-round pick that year. Excited, he says, "I telephoned my father to tell him the good news." And you know what his dad said to him? His dad said, "How does it feel to be second?" So those are some ways that you can speak evil against someone. Words that are intended to hurt, lying, or just being hypercritical. In his book, Resisting Gossip, Matthew Mitchell identifies 3 ways we judge poorly that I thought were very helpful. First, he says we speak evil against others. We're judging in the wrong way when we rush to judgment. When we rush to judgment. So Proverbs 18, verse 13 is a famous verse. It says, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame." So this was my dad's big verse. Every time I would ask him for counsel, he would say, "I need more information." And it would sometimes drive me crazy, but he was trying to teach me that if you give an answer before you actually know what you're talking about, you're not wise. You're actually a fool. And so how do we rush to judgment? So we're judging poorly and disobeying James' command when we rush to judgment. But how do we do that? Sometimes we rush to judgment because we only listen to one side of the story. That's actually something that Proverbs talks about first. The first to argue his case, it seems right to you until another comes. And so sometimes one person will tell us their side of the story, and bang, it is locked in. This is how it is. And we didn't discover the other side of the story. And you know what you need to do if you haven't heard the other side of the story? Not make a judgment. You need to suspend judgment. Not considering the source is another way we rush to judgment. This is what Matthew Mitchell says that I thought was really helpful. He said, "Hearsay and secondhand information must be treated with the utmost care. Filling in the gaps of a story through guesswork and speculations will get us into trouble really quickly. Questionable sources of information should be treated like hot uranium." So a lot of times people will come to you and they'll say, "Somebody said this," or "I heard this person say this to that person." And then you make a judgment. That is a bad way to make a judgment. That's very difficult to make a good judgment off of information like that. And yet it's very common, right? I was even in a situation recently where I was describing something to someone, but I was the one who was giving secondhand information, and they need to, if they're going to judge correctly, they need to talk to the person directly, which is actually what I'm going to tell them when I talk to them tomorrow. But Proverbs, I am literally going to talk to them tomorrow. But Proverbs 18, verse 15, "An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge." So we rush to judgment when we listen to only one side of the story, when we don't consider the source, when we don't gather enough data, enough information. A second way we rush to judgment and make poor judgments and end up slandering others and speaking evil against others is when we assume motives. This is probably one of the most common ways we make poor judgments. We think we are mind readers. And so really listen to yourself when you're talking about somebody else. Are you saying that you know why they did what they did. Because if you're saying that, you just have to be really careful, because you are not God and you are not omniscient. And a lot of times people are confusing, and they're not like you. So they do things for very different reasons than you would do them. We need to become, this is something that I pray that we really make a commitment to. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says, love believes the best. And so part of believing the best is assuming the best, not the worst, about someone's motives. So you want to try until it's absolutely impossible to believe that they're doing it for a good motive. Now, that doesn't mean that you just put your head in the ground and just ignore everything, but it does mean when you go to them, you should go humbly, ask them for a different interpretation. I've had to do that recently, where I've had to go to someone and give them what they said and say, can you help me understand a different way to think about this? Help me understand, prove my interpretation wrong. This feels like the only way I can interpret that. Please show that my interpretation is not the correct interpretation, because I want to believe the best about that. Unless someone tells you what motivates them, or it's become obvious through a pattern of incontrovertible facts that can lead to no other reasonable conclusion, we need to assume the best. And that should be easy for us, because people are so different. Like, people are so different, and like after a while of relating to people, it does become pretty obvious that it is very hard to read people, right? Like, we had a funny one the other day. We were at a basketball game, and Levi and I were there at Lincoln's basketball game, and there was a dad of the other team there. And this guy was so loud. I'm not quiet. I think I'm joyful, but to me, he seemed very loud, and really talking about the refs every time they did something. And it just was, I was judging him upside down. I mean, I was judging him up and down, and looking at Levi every once in a while and being like, oh my goodness. And, their kids would make a point and he'd be like, bam, and then Levi was tempted to do that after our kids made a point. I'm like, that's not great, but I know why you want to do that, I said. And so anyway, I was, and then they got into a little altercation with somebody else at the end of the game. But then we went to I took the boys to get ice cream. And I get out of the car, we get to the ice cream place, and I look over there, and there they are. And I'm like, oh, Lord, no, please, I don't. And he definitely seemed like one of those guys that was going to come over and talk to me, and I'm like, oh, no. And he was one of those guys. He came right over and he brought over his wife and his son, and he introduced himself, and then he just was talking so long, but, he was the nicest guy ever, and he was just, like, bragging on Lincoln and how good he was, and then, talking to me about how kind I was. I was, like, getting lower and lower. And, I found out we homeschool, and he's like, oh, yeah, I figure, and I don't know, we must look like homeschoolers or something, I don't know, and so anyway, then we start walking to the car, and as I'm about the car, it's like from here to there. He's like, hey, because he's just like a loud guy. He's like, hey. I'm like, yeah, I turn around. He's like, I just want to say I'm so sorry, man. I'm so sorry for the way I acted at that game. I feel so bad about my behavior. And I got into their car, and I was like, wow, boys, who is the jerk? It was not him. Who was the kind guy? It was not me. That guy was really the kind guy. It wasn't me that was the kind guy, because I had been judging him up and down. And then on the radio was Grace Got You. So I was like, that's my only hope, God's kindness. And I was so glad that had happened, that I got to see him after the game. Otherwise, I would have been tempted to go home and tell Marta, you won't believe this guy, how proud he was. And I'm sure he struggled with pride like the rest of us, but that's not what was going on, I don't think. It was clear that he was just a kind, happy guy that was really into his son's game. And I assumed things about him that were not true. And so we need to be careful that we work at assuming the best, and recognize that a lot of times we're wrong about what is motivating other people. Just people go through so many different things, and their temperaments are so different. It's just very hard. It's very hard to know for sure why somebody does something, or even that they see it the way that you see it. I don't know if I grew up in a home that never yelled. Like my parents were not yellers. I can't think of a time when they yelled. But then I would go over to other people's homes sometimes when I was a kid, and it felt like they were always yelling. And then I would talk to my friends, and it was like they didn't even notice the yelling. And it made me realize, okay, wow, like that to them, that they're not hearing that as yelling the way that I'm hearing it. Because it's just, I don't know that it's right, but at least it's different to them than it is to me, because they're used to it. And people are very, very different. It's very hard. It doesn't mean that we just put our heads in the sand and just can't know anything, but it does mean that we are careful, try to assume the best, and if we can't, we at least recognize we could be wrong. We put an interpretation out there, ask them, and hope that hopefully we are wrong. And this is challenging, of course, when we disciple others, because sin is deceitful, and you want to be able to help them see what's in their heart. But you just have to recognize that as you do that, you have to be very, very careful, because sin isn't only deceitful for them, it's also deceitful to you. So bad judgments, what do they look like? Well, sometimes it's when we rush to judgment. Second, of course, prideful judgment, and we're gonna is bad judgment. That's we know we're going the wrong direction if it's prideful judgment. And we're going to see that as we look at James 4:11 and 12, because he talks about judging the law, and then he talks about acting like you're God. But Matthew Mitchell, in his book, he suggests asking questions of yourself as you begin evaluating and speaking about others. And so one good question to ask yourself is this my place to do this? Like, do I need to make this judgment? So sometimes we're acting, we are judging others when that's not really our position. There's no real reason for us to do that. We're not their boss. We don't have that kind of relationship with them. I think this is when somebody comes to listen to preaching. I think this is a challenge, because you need to be able to discern, is this guy telling me truth or not? But you're not there to be a critiquer of, it's not entertainment. Like, is this guy funnier than David Letterman or whatever? You're there to see Christ and to learn to enjoy Christ. I have to think that because I am a preacher. So when I go to hear other preachers, it would be very tempting for me to be like, oh, well, how's his points, all those kinds of things. But that's not usually my role when I go to hear another preacher. If he asks me, can you help me? Then that would be my role. But that's not my role at that point, to be there as his critiquer. My role is to be there as a listener who wants to know Christ better. So is this my place when I'm talking this way? Sometimes when, we're doing that, really, we're going to see that we're acting like we think we're supposed to be the judge of the whole world. Am I part of this situation? What part am I of this situation? So, sometimes I think that we like to do this here in America, just everybody needs to have a hot take on every single situation that's out there. And you have to sometimes step back and just ask yourself, am I even part of this? What good is my hot take going to be on this right now? Like, has anybody, am I going to move that person forward or not? Sometimes that's a little complicated, so somebody might do something. Nowadays, we find out so much information so fast. So like a pastor in Cleveland says something about somebody in his church, and then it's all over Twitter, what he said, and everybody's asking everybody, what do you think about this pastor in Cleveland and what he said? And sometimes it's kind of confusing. You have to stop and think, well, what is my role right now? What is my part? Do I need to give my hot take on this situation? Would it be, in what way is this going to actually help someone? Maybe it would be helpful. Maybe there would be a time to say it, but maybe to say it, I would have to gather a lot more information, right? Am I able to gather all that other information before I give my hot take? Is it that important for me to do that? Is judging this person my calling, my responsibility? Obviously, again, as a leader, sometimes it is actually your calling because you need to protect others from someone who is dangerous. So that can be part of our calling. But we have to think about it. What is the point right now of me talking about this person in this way? Because again, sometimes there is a point. But even then, we have to be careful we don't start thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought. And so to keep ourselves from doing that, we should apply Jesus' challenge, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So you might ask yourself, okay, I'm about to speak. I have to speak about this person. How would I want them to speak about me? So of course, if I'm in sin, I want them to speak about me, actually. I want them to speak even maybe strongly, but I would want them to speak kindly. I would want them to gather information before they do it. I would want them to not just assume motives and all of those things. With what standard would I want to be judged? Would I want to be judged by some outside the Bible ridiculous standard that's not even real? Sometimes parents do this to their kids, they're critiquing them, and the standard they're critiquing them on isn't even realistic. It's not a biblical standard. They're shouting where the Bible whispers, but also it's not even a standard that they as parents could keep up with. I remember thinking about this with our kids when we would go to the grocery store and we'd have to say no to them getting something that they want. And so I would have to think, what would be an appropriate response to wanting something really badly and then having your dad say no to you? And you can't really understand why. Well, I think certainly an inappropriate response would be just crying and acting like the end of the world's happening. That's not appropriate. But also, I wouldn't expect that they'd just be like, hallelujah, this is so awesome that I didn't get what I wanted. Thank you, Dad, for saying no to me because I know this is just your pure love for me. I realize, okay, I would be probably disappointed. My face might be a little bit like that. It might take me a couple minutes to process it. I might have to be self-controlled, of course, and not sin in the way I respond, but I can't expect them to change their emotions in a second. That would be very difficult for me, and I'm 49. So with what standard would I want to be judged? Is it realistic? With what attitude would I want to be judged? Even sometimes the standard, your kid's sitting in church, which I mean, if we keep doing that, but if your kids are sitting in church as somebody's preaching and they're 5, probably your standard shouldn't be that they're never going to move and just sit there like this the whole time, because most adults don't do that. I get to see all you guys, and hardly anybody sits like that. Or that every Sunday they come, they're just going to be like, this is amazing. A lot of times you come, and it's hard to get through a whole sermon. We all know what that's like. But what would be the standard? Well, I'd expect that over time, there's going to be better days, and there's going to be worse days, but they're going to be learning slowly but surely how to have self-control. With what attitude would I want to be judged? Mitchell tells a story. This Matthew Mitchell in his book, he tells about a story he once heard. He says, a young couple moved into a new neighborhood. The next morning while they were eating breakfast, the young woman saw her neighbor hanging the wash outside. And she said, the laundry's not very clean. She doesn't know how to wash correctly. Perhaps she needs better laundry soap. Her husband looked on but remained silent. Every time her neighbor would hang her wash to dry, the young woman would make the same comments. About 1 month later, the woman was surprised to see a nice clean wash on the line, and she said to her husband, "Look, she's learned how to wash correctly. I wonder who taught her this." The husband said, "I got up early this morning and cleaned our windows." And so it is with life. What we see when watching others depends on the window through which we look. And so sometimes as we're judging others, we're actually saying a lot about ourselves. And really what we're saying is, that's what I would mean if I did that. Or that's how I act. Not always, but a lot of times. And because of that, it's nice when you judge someone else to be able to put your finger on a Bible verse if you're going to speak strongly. And it's always, always good to ask questions if you're not understanding. Always good. We try to teach our kids this so much as they're growing up. Like, it's so easy to be so dogmatic, but just tweak it a little bit. Instead of saying it dogmatically, just ask it. Like, is it possible that this is what's going on? Or this is the way it seems to me. Can you give me a different explanation? It's good to realize my background may impact the way I'm seeing this. So, like when we were in Africa, when the ladies would go over to somebody's house to eat, they'd have a fellowship meal. The Americans would go, and sometimes they would think, I'm being so kind because I'm going even though I feel sick. But because I feel sick, and it's like all this strange food, I'm not going to eat. I'm just going to go. And that's really kind. But the Africans then would be like, how dare they come and not eat our food? That is so proud. That is so proud that they would not eat our food. And so they wouldn't ask. They would just know this is pride for somebody to not eat our food when they come like this. And they would get all offended. Sometimes they would get all offended and not realize that, hey, maybe my background impacted. It seems so obvious to me that has to be the only explanation is because they're proud. But they didn't stop to think, maybe my background impacted the way I see this. Another funny one is, like, Americans, we tend to be loud, especially when we go to other countries. And if you see the way, I always, like, when I'm in a foreign airport, I'm like, wow, I am such an American. It's like, just with your friends, just talking so loud, and then everybody else seems so sophisticated as they're walking through. And so sometimes it's easy for people, you could see how it could be tempting to be like, oh, those people, they're so proud because they're so loud, and not realize maybe they are, but maybe that's also a cultural way of talking that, they don't even recognize. They don't even know that they're doing it. I can say that about Americans, but it also tends to be true of Liberians. And that's different than some other parts of Africa. So sometimes when you hear the Liberians coming and having a conversation, like, whoa, man, it's just like us, but it's like, oh, man, I know everything you guys are saying way over there. How you doing? And other cultures might look at that and say, well, that's something, those guys are so loud that means this, but it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily mean that at all. And people have different, sometimes they were doing that because if people saw you whispering, they would think you're gossiping about them. And so in their culture, they had learned to talk really loudly when they're in groups so that everybody would know we're not whispering, we're not gossiping. And so, different, but it's important if we're not going to judge and speak evil, it's important not to rush to judgments, and it's important to watch out for prideful judgments. Proverbs 11:12 says, a man who lacks judgment derides his neighbor, but a man of understanding holds his tongue. And again, that does not mean that you can't ask questions. It doesn't mean that you can't evaluate. It doesn't mean that you can't share your opinion. But it certainly should mean that you are open to being proven wrong and that you're happy, actually, if you're proven wrong. And then a third kind of mistake that we make when it comes to judging, rushing to judgment, prideful judgment, and then just unloving judgment, of course. But there's two kinds of judging. There's judging that is just critical, me on my high horse, thinking I'm better than the rest of the world. And then there's what a teacher has to do. A good teacher has to obviously evaluate their class so that they can help them better. What a coach has to do. What somebody who wants to help. For me to help you, obviously I need to know where you're at so that I can help you move forward. But we want to pursue love in our judgments, and one simple way to do that is to apply 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8 to how you're talking about others. Listen to what Paul says. This is very familiar. But he says, love is patient and kind. So these are good ways to evaluate the way you judge others. Am I being patient? Is this kind? Love does not envy. Is it motivated, what I'm saying now, by some jockeying for position? Love does not boast. Am I talking this way now because I want to put myself above the other person? Love is not arrogant or rude. Is this the right time? Is this the way this person would hear it? So rude is often is tricky because different folks have different definitions of rude, but I need to try to, as best as I can, get to know the person I'm talking to so that I don't speak in rude ways to them. But also they need to get to know me and show me a break as well. But love does not insist on its own way. So is this me just having to have my way? It's not irritable. It's just me being grumpy. It's not resentful. Is this me talking about this not because of this situation, but because of something that happened 3 years ago that I'm still bugged about and I haven't actually forgiven the person over, and I'm just using this new situation as an opportunity to come down on this person? Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. And there's, again, that do I really want to believe the best about this person? Or am I really kind of hoping that I can show that they're wrong? Love hopes all things, endures all things. So as we look at the way we speak about others, we know we're speaking evil against them. We're judging them poorly if it's not motivated by love. And love means something. It's not just whatever we want it to mean. It means 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. And so as a church, we are concerned about sin, and we're concerned about people's spiritual good. So we're going to be evaluating. That's just parents evaluate, friends evaluate. We're going to evaluate, but we need to be very careful how we do. James tells us what we must avoid. We must not speak evil against one another, and we must not judge in the wrong way. And then why? Why does he tell us that we shouldn't do this? And he gives us two reasons. The first reason is, do not speak evil against one another, brothers. First reason, the one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. And then the second reason, there's only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So this is a problem. Speaking evil against somebody, this is a problem you might think is just about you and that other person. But James says, no, it's actually a problem in your relationship with God. The reason why you're like this is not just because you have problems with people, it's because you have problems with God. And the first problem is that you think you know better than God's law. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. And so when you slander someone, you're setting yourself up as a judge over them, and that means you're saying, I know enough, or I have the right to say that what you're doing is wrong. Most of us understand that. You can think about the last conversation you had where you criticized somebody. You're saying, I know how they should have acted. I know the way they should have said this or the way they should have done that. And I don't think that their motives were good. So you're setting yourself up as a judge. But when you do that, you're not just judging them, you're judging God's law. When you slander someone else, you're disobeying God's law, and you're saying you don't need to obey it. That you actually know better than God does in that situation. And that's what James says at the end of verse 11. He says, if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. So if you slander your neighbor, you slander God's law, you say, God tells you not to slander, not to speak against this person, but God doesn't know what's best. And if you slander God's law, you're obviously not obeying it. And by not obeying God's law, you're making a statement. You're saying, I can do what I want, and what's that? That's pride. So when you slander someone, this is a big deal because you're basically saying, I don't need to do what God says. You can imagine a guy who's driving his car and he refuses to stop at red lights. And he just keeps driving on the wrong side of the road, and he never keeps the speed limit. And the policeman pulls him over and says, hey, man, you need to stop at this red light. And he's like, well, that's your opinion. That's a dumb law. I don't like the red light law. That guy's dangerous, and that guy's going to end up in jail. And how much more foolish and dangerous is it for us to disregard God's law? If God says don't slander, and the whole world says it's not a big deal, God's right. He has a reason why he says this. And so it's not just because he's coming up with a random rule to make your life more difficult. It's because he wants our good, and he wants us to bring him glory, and slander doesn't do that. And you'd think that would be enough to get us to hate it, just to realize, wow, when I am hypercritical, when I'm slanderous, I'm just proud and thinking I know better than God. But James gets even more intense. He puts it in perspective in verse 12. He says, there's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who's able to save and destroy, but who are you to judge your neighbor? And so when you slander someone, you're placing yourself above God's law, and when you place yourself above God's law, you're placing yourself above God. So when we speak against somebody, we're acting like we're more important than them, but we're not just acting like we're more important than them. We're acting like we're more important than God. And so your problem is not, why do we slander? Your problem is not that you think you're better than others. Your problem is that you think you're better than God. James says there's only one lawgiver and judge. Guess who it is? It's not you. The one who's able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge your neighbor? I always loved, I've told you before, when I would get into a mode where I was talking negatively about someone, and my dad would say to me, wouldn't it be great if the whole world was just like you? And I loved when he would say that, because he was telling me what I really was saying. And that's what James is doing here. He's like, yeah, don't you think you're God? You and I were not God. God's the only one who has the right to make laws. He's the only one who has that right because he's the only one who's able to save, and he's the only one who's able to destroy. And so who in the world do we think we are to sit in the place that only God can and should occupy? You can imagine someone who's tone deaf criticizing Mozart, or someone who never played basketball trying to teach LeBron James the fundamentals of the game. You'd say they're foolish. They have no right. But those illustrations pale in comparison with one of us trying to sit in God's seat as judge, and yet that's what we're doing when we judge our neighbor. We're trying to be God. So as we go to evaluate others, we need to absolutely need to, but we have to make sure we do so in a way that demonstrates we know who we are, we know who God is, and we're going to use our words in a way that demonstrates that. How? James says, okay, let me tell you what not to do. You're going to have to speak, but don't speak words to hurt. Don't say things that you don't know are true. Say words for their good, for God's glory, motivated by how the Bible defines love, shouting where God shouts, whispering where God whispers, remembering who you are, not as the judge, but as another sinner who needs God's grace and needs God's help. So we're going to keep talking about gossip just for one more, and slander for one more week, but because it's really a problem, and also because I think it's something that we have to think about, because it's not always simple. It's not always simple. We have to speak, we have to judge, but judging can be really, really dangerous and do a lot of damage to us and to others. Yeah, any thoughts or any questions? Yeah, Dennis, and then we'll. Yeah.